You can take two or more colors and blend them together using a gradient effect. And Photoshop gives you lots of options to apply gradients to selections and to layers. So let's take a closer look. Well, here's an image that actually has some items selected, and then it has the full background in there. And I'm going to use that to paint some gradients. I'm going to start with a blank layer. Make sure it's in the right order here, because when you paint to gradients or apply gradients, it actually affects the entire layer or the selection. Now there's a gradient tool, and you can click on that. You can see that gradient tool right here, and it gives you some different types of gradients that you can use. And if I click on the drop down, I can see different options in here. And some of these gradients are actually based on the colors that you have selected. I'm going to go ahead and choose this first one. Click on OK. And then also, depending on the type of gradient, you have some different options available for you. So for example, there's a linear gradient. And that's going to apply it in a rectangular mode. Let's go ahead and just try that one out. And you, depending on the direction that you draw this and the length of that line, you're going to get different results. There's also radial gradient, and the radial is going to be like a circle. And again, that direction affects it. Let's just change this even to different gradient here, and affects it. There's a conical, and you get one with a pattern where it goes in a line. This actually can be an interesting effect when you're trying to create something that looks almost 3D. We'll come back to that one in a moment. And then we've got another one using like a diamond shape. Some of the gradients too also have a transparency in them. So if I click on the gradient here with the transparency, then it means it's going to blend in with the tools behind it. And again, it's pulling in some of the color from our foreground as well. So you have a full color, and then you have some of these transparent options. Now, when we were applying this as a gradient, it was actually applying it to the entire layer, as we saw. And we can even create our own gradients. Now, normally what I would do is I'd click on the drop down, and I'd go out and use that fly out, and I'd see some options in here. Let's try even new gradient. But it doesn't really let me create a new gradient. It's just showing me what I already have. So I'm going to cancel that out. The way that you get into the gradients is you actually click on the sample. So you just click on that sample, it opens it up to the gradient editor, and here's where you can create the gradients that you want. Now you can add color stops. You can see right now I have 4. It just has to do with the gradient I got started with. So I could add color stops just by clicking or pulling them straight down. I can remove color stops. I have to have at least 2 because the gradient is blending 2 or more colors. I'm going to go ahead and move these out a little bit. Add a third one in there. And if I double click on the color stop, I can actually change it, use a color picker to change to whatever I want. You could also click on a color stop and access it through the color option. And then you can create your different effects. You also have some blending options of how the colors are blending with each other and transitions, or you can simply move the color around. I'm just going to go ahead and change it. I could also make sure it's at a 50% if I wanted to, make it sure it's really even. Go ahead and click on that again. And if I click on New, it actually then saves it as one of my presets. I'm going to change this here and make that a bright red color, just like we had before. I'll add that as well. New. So now I've got these different presets. I could even save all these presets. If I save them, I'm able to create my own gradient library. When you save something in Photoshop, Adobe has some preset areas where it's going to store your things like gradients or patterns or brushes that you might have stored. But you could also store them anywhere you wanted to. So in fact, I'll go ahead and do that. Access another place where I'm keeping my files. And I'll just give it a name to help me remember that they're my gradients. And then you could, when it's stored like this, then you could actually load it later, or you could share that file and someone else could load it on their system. You could even share it with the community and then the Photoshop Exchange, and other people could access that file as well. But we've got a couple gradients in here. I'm going to go ahead and choose OK. And let's start with this first one, this red, white, and blue, and I'll use my linear. And you can see how it pulls it across. And then I'll try this one with the red, white, and red. You can see it pulls it across. And here's where this effect, when they hover over it, the reflected gradient actually has a really interesting option as well. You can see how it's creating an interesting effect right there. Go back to my, go back to my linear, and I'll do a real short one, and you can see some of those scenarios. Now, in addition to the gradients that we're seeing here, we can always add more. We've got some different items. I'm going to go ahead and append them. That'll add them to our list. Pastels. And I won't add all of them, but I'll get a kind of idea. So I've added some color harmonies, some pastels, some photographic toning, some special effects. And let's add some spectrums. There was one other I wanted to point out, and that had to do with the noise. And noise samples have a different type of gradient, typically. They're more randomized. Let's take a closer look. When we're building gradients, we can create a gradient type that is a noise or a solid. When we did solid, we use these color stops. But when we use noise, there aren't any color stops. It's just a blend of colors. And then you're picking the roughness. So it looks more like a UPC symbol. And then we could create that as our gradient. You can see some interesting effects right there too. Let's take a closer look at some gradients with transparency. So here's an example of a gradient that has transparency in it. And when you use a gradient with transparency, it's cumulative over the other items. So if I were to apply it, make sure I get the right one there. So show that up. And if I start applying it on top, it's actually applying on top of the other gradients. And so it's pulling it on top of each other. Here's it, play that again. You can see how it's going together. They're blending. Let's take a closer look at this. Now, in addition to your color stops, you also have at the top, you have some options that give you opacity. And so right now this opacity is at 0, whereas here the opacity is at 100%. And I can even add another stop and change the opacity to 0 with that slider, or somewhere in the middle. Create a new gradient. And when I use this gradient in conjunction with some of the other ones, it's adding that effect. Now, we've been applying gradients to the actual layer. You can also apply gradients to a selection. So one way to create a selection is you simply make the selection you want first. And I'm going to hold down my control key and click on this mask. By doing that, I'm selecting the pixels of the mask right there. And when I apply my gradient, let's go ahead and try one that's full of color. When I apply the gradient, it actually affects everything within that pixel, within that selection only. The other thing that you can do when you're applying these gradients, right? Go ahead and deselect that, is I could come over here to, I've got this other document, and I can apply this gradient with some different effects, but I could actually apply the gradient to the mask itself. Now, when I change to the mask, the colors switch to this black and white. And I'm going to use something that is a black and white. And now I'm going to create a transparency effect on the mask itself. Now, if I just click and drag across, it's applying it to the entire layer. You can see how the gradient is applied to that entire mask. The white areas are going to reveal pixels, and the black area are going to hide pixels. Let's go ahead and undo that. I could also control click on the mask, and now when I apply the gradient, it's still going to apply it to the mask, but it's only going to apply it to where I've selected, and I can click certain directions, and I can basically add to that mask effect in there. Let's go ahead and undo that. We're going to, or deselect that rather, and we're going to create a text. And we'll just go ahead and select this, Control A and Control Shift bracket to resize it, make it a lot larger. Looks good. Switch to the Move tool and just position it in place. There are many types of effects that you can use, but one of the options that you can do is a gradient overlay. And if you do a gradient overlay, you can again pick from all these different gradients, or you can even go in and access some more of those libraries. But you can go ahead and pick from the different gradients. Let's try one that will add some contrast to it. And it's applying that gradient automatically to the layer. And it doesn't have to be type. It could be any kind of pixels, but it's applying to that layer. And again, you have some options for controlling the angle and controlling the scale. So it simulates when we were using the gradient tool to draw our lines in different directions and different angles and lengths. It's simulating that same option. And here's where you can choose the linear, radial, reflected, etc. And even have some different blending modes of how those colors are going to interact. We'll go ahead and click on OK. And finally, we can create an actual fill layer. Let me go down here to the bottom and create a fill layer. Oops, undo that. Got to get in the right spot. There we go. Create a fill layer that's based on gradients. And when I do that, I can choose any gradient that I want, and I can also choose the style that I want to use, and I can choose the angle and even the scale. Let's go ahead and click on OK. And what I like about these fill layers is that if you change your canvas size, they're percent based, and they're actually going to rearrange to the canvas. So I don't have to worry about refilling the layer to accommodate the different adjustments to my canvas. I can even come in here and add a blending mode, and it's blending with the pixels below it. So you can take two or more layers and blend them together and create some really interesting effects. Well, now it's time for a pop quiz. What is the minimum number of color stops needed to create a gradient? A, 1, B, 2, C, 3, D, 100. The answer is B, 2. So when you take all of your colors and you blend them together, you can start experimenting with layers, selections, and even some of those layer masks.